Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And again, you can find out more about us at tertiumquids.org. And if you go to YouTube and search Freedom and Prosperity Radio, you can go and download all sorts of previous episodes of the program and catch up with us here. Up next, as the General Assembly is just gaveling in and the first few days under our belts, Sean Parnell is on with us from Save Our States. There are national popular vote bills in the Virginia General Assembly, HB 177 and HB 199, taking up a crazy cause where so many of these states are just abandoning their own say in the process in this effort to be part of this national popular vote movement for presidential elections. Sean, welcome back to the program. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on.
And Happy New Year to you. First and foremost, catch people up if they may have heard of the national popular vote movement first, and then we'll get into the specifics of what Virginia is trying to do. But what is the national popular vote movement for the listeners who haven't studied up on it, and how many states have signed in on it?
Sure. So it is an interstate compact that would effectively abolish the Electoral College as the way that we elect the president, and instead we would have a direct election of the president. What they've done is they've proposed essentially hijacking the Electoral College, and rather than the way we do it today, of course, is each state's citizens go and vote, and then that vote determines how their electoral votes are cast. Mm-hmm. Here in Virginia, for example, we have 13 electoral votes.
Right.
What the national popular vote would do is that states that sign on to it agree that rather than award their electoral votes based on the votes of their citizens, the way their voters have chosen, they will instead look to this sort of cobbled together national popular vote total, try and get vote totals from all of the other states and determine which candidate received the most votes, and then award the electoral votes to that candidate, even if the state's voters went for a different candidate.
Now, I remember years and years ago, I was broadcaster in Buffalo, New York in 2000 as the hanging Chad election was unfolding. And after that, we were talking with one of the New York state electors who told me, he was the Erie County Democratic Party chair and I think a county supervisor. And I said, do you have to vote for Al Gore if you don't feel like it, if you feel like there's something against it? And he said, well, I don't have to, but if I want a career in Democratic Party politics going forward, I will. And I guess that's sort of the control that the electors have. There's no guarantee, and I think if I remember my Federalist Papers, the whole point of the Electoral College was to provide one last check list of people looking at the president elect and deciding do or should they get their vote, and that the convening of the college was actually a chance for these electors in some cases to meet the presidential hopeful for the first time.
Yeah, that's sort of a separate issue, the question of whether electors are bound to vote for the candidate that they pledged that they would vote for. There's some interesting legal cases actually out there right now, but that's kind of a separate issue. Yeah. The National Popular Vote Compact is specifically about which slate of electors
slating is a good word
from each state.
Yes, slating is a good term because I think in Virginia we've heard that quite a bit in our local conventions. They hear slating, and then most Virginians go, "Whoa, I don't want that," because it's sort of taking your vote away from you and saying, "Well, it's what everyone else wanted," and so we're just going to count your vote as like everybody else's. There are a couple of states though that do the opposite, where they apportion their electors by the districts. So, say in Virginia in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, President Trump didn't win the state, but as the Republican nominee, he carried a good number of the congressional districts, and he would have gotten credit for those electors, and Hillary Clinton would have gotten the statewide two representing our senators, and then the districts that she won, I think would have come out to be, if I'm not mistaken, 7-4 or 6-5, something along those lines, where she wouldn't have gotten all 13. I think it's Indiana is one state that does it that way, and maybe it's Maine.
Actually, it's Maine and Nebraska.
Nebraska.
Those are the two states that do it by congressional delegations.
So it's sort of the opposite of this national popular vote movement. It actually gives each congressional district more authority than that. So how many states have signed into this compact? Because there's some discussion, and some people think that the Electoral College would go away if you got a mandate number of states. Although, as I understood it, it's just an agreement that they're going to, as you said, slate their electors.
Yeah, the way that it works is, frankly, the way it should work is if you want to get rid of the Electoral College and adopt a direct election, which obviously I think is a terrible idea,
Yeah.
But if you want to do that, you need to amend the Constitution. You need to change the Constitution to allow for that. And what this is basically an end run around the Constitution by some very clever law professors who came up with this idea after the 2000 election. And at this time, there are 16 states plus the District of Columbia that have signed on as members of the compact, and between them, they have 196 electoral votes in this block. And if and when, and I hope it doesn't happen, obviously, but if and when that number reaches 270, with enough states, maybe about 21 states, depending on the mix of states, but when enough states with 270 total electoral votes between them have signed on to the compact, that is when this goes into effect, because it takes 270 electoral votes, of course, to elect the president. So once that happens, they have a block large enough that regardless of what the majority of states want, regardless of the fact that they haven't gone through the constitutional amendment process, which would require 38 states to sign on, they would effectively have repealed the Electoral College with a minority of states and move forward with a direct election of the president.
Sean Parnell is on with us. Save Our States is the organization, saveourstates.com. He's the outreach director there, Sean, and we're talking about this idea of direct electing. Is this, though, you talk about reaching that 270 trigger point, isn't it, though, non-binding, so that if a state that was part of the 270, their elections swing the way Virginians have in the last 10 years? We're all Republican 10 years ago, and now we're all Democrat. Couldn't they conceivably then have a state drop out in this race to 270? Or once it gets there, is it binding?
So this is one of the many, many weaknesses of the compact and problems that it creates. So right now, before the compact goes into effect, of course, a state could withdraw from the compact, one that has already joined. And I've talked with state legislators that wants to do this. They say things to me like, well, that was more than a decade ago that my state joined up, and I don't think that anybody in the legislature even remembers that we joined it, and maybe we ought to reevaluate this. But one of the real weaknesses of the compact is that you could potentially have a situation where a state, after the election, if it goes differently than the way they were hoping, or it goes differently than the way the voters of that state voted, then you could have a state try and withdraw from the compact, and it's not clear that they can't do that. I mean, imagine a scenario in which the national popular vote is in effect and a Republican wins it, and then all of a sudden the Massachusetts legislature decides, hey, wait a minute, no, we're not cool with that because our electorate went 65-35 for the Democrat, so we're just going to pull out of this and give our electoral votes the way our voters wanted. You're going to have a constitutional crisis, a political nightmare.
A real one.
I mean, it's just a terrible, terrible situation.
Well, and I know that this is based off the mass media hysteria over the fact that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. But I also saw some very interesting demographics, Sean, that said that if you take out New York County, which is Manhattan Island, and Los Angeles County, which is downtown Los Angeles, from the vote total, not only does Donald Trump wins fairly comfortably in the popular vote even as well. And that in and of itself is a master's class in exactly why they set up the Electoral College, so that two counties, the most populous in the nation, couldn't throw the election to whoever wins New York and Los Angeles.
Yeah, and actually, you don't even have to take out New York. If you just take out Los Angeles County, then, well, actually, no. If you take out California's margin, then Donald Trump wins. If you take out Los Angeles County and New York County combined, then yeah, you've got a different result. And that was one of the things that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. Before the Constitution was ratified, states were all equal in pretty much everything that they agreed to do. I mean, this goes back to the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, when each state had one vote. The First and the Second Continental Congresses, which then became the Congress of the Confederation, each state had one vote. In order for states to be willing to give up that level of equality and accept something that would diminish their equality, because now all of a sudden Delaware doesn't have as many members in the House of Representatives as New York does or as Virginia does. Part of that bargain was, one, obviously the U.S. Senate, but two, the fact that it was states that elected the president, not a direct election of the president, where Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York would have simply overwhelmed everybody. Right. The Electoral College was part of the checks and balances that allowed the compromise to occur, that these states who previously all had the same vote in the Continental Congress, it allowed them to agree to sign on to the Constitution. Without the Electoral College, you don't have 13 states signing on to the Constitution. And now what you have is a national popular vote essentially looking at one of the key compromises, one of the contractual elements of the Constitution, and saying, you know what, we're going to break that contract. We're going to go even further away from the idea that states are independent sovereign entities with, political value in and of themselves, and we're simply going to go more towards this direct democracy model where it doesn't matter what the small states want. We're just going to have the large population centers govern everything, or at least as much as is possible, such as through direct election of the president.
Do the states that have signed in on this, Sean, if I'm not mistaken, none of them are named New York or California yet, and I may be wrong on that, but I had seen a list that had most of the states being of the kind of size Virginia was, 10 to 20 some odd electoral votes, who would never ever see a presidential campaign ever again, because we've been rendered irrelevant in this scenario. Why would any elector, a Democrat or a Republican, want to give up any sort of say that they have in the matter?
Yeah, and for California and New York have joined on to the compact because they're large population centers. They love this idea because it gives them more power. Right. Illinois and New Jersey, some of these other large states, but you do have a number of smaller states like Vermont and Hawaii and Rhode Island that have signed on as well. And I mean, it's complicated is the answer to why people would be willing to forsake their state in favor of allowing the major population centers to determine the president. But I think that what it gets down to for a lot of people, And this is unfortunate, but they've really imbibed the idea that we're a democracy. And they haven't really accepted or aren't fully aware of the fact that actually we're a republic, we're a democratic republic, but we have institutions and features that are intended, among other things, to restrain the majorities and make sure that it's not just majorities of the population that always get their way. We have things like the Bill of Rights and the Senate and the Electoral College that is intended to put a brake on some majoritarian sentiment from time to time, and to ensure that it isn't just the majority able to run roughshod over the minority on everything.
Yeah, making sure the sheep has some say in what the wolves have for lunch, as the expression. So, in Virginia, as we look at these two bills coming forward, Sean, HB 177, HB 199, talk about those bills and what you've been able to unearth in terms of the possibility that they even make it out of committee, which is, blessedly how many of these Virginia bills never even see the House floor.
Sure. So the committee hasn't even met yet, and so it's really difficult to get a sense. And in fact, I think that the full committee membership hasn't been figured out yet, or at least not publicly released at this date. But here's what I can say about these bills is there are more co-sponsors, they call them patrons actually, but there are more signed legislators on these bills this year than there have been in the past. There are a total of 13 legislators, 2 senators, and 11 delegates. In the past years, there might not even be a bill, or there might be 1 or 2 legislators who would introduce it and be sponsors or co-sponsors. So that tells me that there is going to be a significant effort in 2020 to get Virginia to join on to the compact. Now, it's just sort of looking at the politics of it. Of course, we have had a change in control of the legislature. Broadly speaking, Republicans tend to not like the National Popular Vote interstate compact. Democrats tend to be a little bit more favorable. That said, I can tell you, having worked on this issue for 8 or 9 years, I run into Democrats on a regular basis, state legislators who get this, who understand that the NPV compact is a terrible deal for their state, and that it's not the way that our federal system is supposed to operate. And so there are lots of Democrats out there who get this and understand it. The question is, are there enough of them who are willing to, maybe stand up to their leadership or stand up to some certain, loud interest groups and say, you know what, I don't want New York, California, and Illinois to be casting Virginia's electoral votes.
Right.
So that's a big part of the process that we are undertaking at the moment, is to try and reach out and educate legislators, Republicans and Democrats, on why these two bills are bad for Virginia, but they're great for Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, which have about 47 million Americans just in those 3 metropolitan areas alone.
I asked this of a politician discussing this. I said, you've, and it was a Democrat, and I said, you all honk on about campaign finance reform, yet this would put so much money into the pockets of the big networks. It would crush campaign finance because you'd have to be making all your agency buys and all your media buys through New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, and you'd bankrupt yourself just in media buys. And he said, I hadn't really thought of it that way.
Well, my experience is that there's a lot of people that sort of for about 30 seconds, they hear a slogan, they hear a nice little pitch, and they think, yeah, that does sound good. I kind of like this NPV thing. And then you start explaining to them the problems with it, like what you just talked about, like with the fact that there is no actual national popular vote tally. You have 51 separate elections in this country, all operated under different rules. They report numbers differently. The numbers that they are supposed to allegedly rely on to cobble together this popular vote total are not reliable. They're not accurate. They're not timely. It's just an invitation to a disaster. Even if someone kind of generally likes the idea of direct election of the president, boy, this is not the way to go about doing it. It would just be a disaster.
Well, you just brought up something. You reminded me, the former president actually spoke out very eloquently against the national popular vote when he said that you couldn't possibly corrupt the election system because it is so decentralized. I distinctly remember Barack Obama saying that. So one of the biggest advocates against it would be Mr. Illinois politician.
Well, I think he was probably talking about the decentralized nature and how it limited what the Russians could do. But you're right. I mean, that is one of the benefits of the current system, is that each state is responsible for electing its own electors. You know, here in Virginia, we don't care about how New York is doing it. We don't care about how Illinois is doing it, or Texas. We have our rules, our laws, our processes, and they do a pretty good job of figuring out, okay, who won Virginia's electoral votes. But once you go to something like the National Popular Vote Compact, because these states have different processes and laws and standards, what you eventually wind up with, and this does go directly to what President Obama was talking about, what you have to do is you have to centralize control of your elections. Because if you're going to make national popular vote work, you can't have 51 states all doing their own thing and then try and cobble together a vote total at the end. You would have to have a federal takeover. And that's actually something that a few of the advocates of NPV, including one of the law professors who first developed this idea, have been very honest about, in saying, look, the next step is to have complete federal control of elections, or at least have Congress set all of the standards and laws and rules that the states have to follow for their elections. And to me, that is another huge threat to the idea that we're a republic, not a pure democracy. We don't have straight central control of everything, and we have states responsible for their own elections. And national popular vote, you would have to get rid of that if you're going to try and avoid the nightmare scenarios that you will otherwise have when states that are members of the compact cannot get access to the vote totals they need, or the vote totals that they get access to are not accurate, are not complete.
Sure.
So that's one of the main weaknesses of this, is that you are inviting federal takeover of your entire election process.
I guess it comes down to whether we're, in terms of the zeitgeist of the population, are we the shoppers or the beverage drinkers? Because we seem to love our craft brews and our micro coffee shops that are intensely local, but then we want to go to a big box store that is as generic as it comes and is nationwide. So I guess, which Americans are we talking to? Because the same guy will go into Walmart, but then search out some little micro brew on the corner next to an old railway station. So I'd like to tap into the pun intended, that microbrew shopping, a small coffee roaster drinking person more than the Starbucks shopper.
That's an interesting way of putting it. I'll file that one away.
Yeah, well, it seems to be the dysphoria we have, is that we love to shop in the big box stores, but we want to find the micro brews. So hopefully we can that will win out. Sean, thank you so much for everything you do, and you can follow along and support what they do as well at SaveOurStates.com. You have a wonderful weekend, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
All right, thank you. You too. Bye.
Coming up next, Qasem Soleimani and the death thereof. Jim Carafano, Vice President of Catherine Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.